This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 755 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. This year's running back draft class is a really interesting one. You've got Bijan Robinson at the top. A lot of people love Jahmyr Gibbs. Zach Charbonnet looks like a good bet. And then there's a whole lot of question marks. But those question marks aren't a bad thing. It's just that right now, today, we don't seem to have a consensus RB4 in this class. But because it's a pretty deep class, there are a whole lot of running backs who can end up in that spot post-draft. You've heard my take on a lot of these running backs already. So I decided to have a chat with my friend Derek Brown about this class. You may know Derek from his work over at FantasyPros. D-Bro has a different evaluation process than I do, so it's good to get another viewpoint on these players. We talked last week about Bijan Robinson's elite status, Jahmyr Gibbs' size concerns, why Derek is nervous about Kendre Miller, and so much more. The conversation is jam-packed with information. So without further ado, here's my chat with FantasyPros Derek Brown. All right, D-Bro, I think it's important that we sort of establish what your evaluation process is with prospecting. So would you consider yourself someone who leans heavily on data, or are you just grinding film to help evaluating players each and every year? So what's your process like?
All right, so JJ, I'm going to take the other side of this, and I know that people always talk about the marriage of film and data, but that's honestly what I try to do, man. Like, I take a lot of data points, and that's really where I head first. So looking at running backs specifically, I look at yards after contact per attempt, breakaway percentage, PFF elusive rating, and then, you get into the pass game side, like target share, yards per route run, college dominator, collegiate target share. And so I'll break down those things first, see where the prospect lies and stuff, and then I'll head to the film. And as well as I do, like, there's not as much film for some guys that's out there. Yeah. Some guys, like, you can get, and really I try to get as much all 22 as I can. If I can, and it's out there, I try to watch at least 5 games for every player that I'm evaluating. And then as I'm watching film and I get into that, I will also kind of go back to the numbers to help explain some of the things that I'm seeing on film. With running backs, is it a guy that, maybe he's not a breakaway runner. Okay, you see that in the numbers. Maybe he has run in an offense collegiately that was really zone heavy, or he's scheme versatile. So really trying to marry the two as best as I possibly can to really get the best picture that I can of these prospects. And that's really for running backs, for wide receivers, for every position is what I do that for.
All right, so now that we have that established, we know that you're not as nerdy as I am with this stuff. Although
I try to be.
To be fair, we're all nerds here.
I'm not a model guy, so I can't say the word model on this show, but I did.
Exactly. Let's talk about these prospects, because this is a really interesting 2023 running back class. It feels like we're sort of obligated to kick things off with Bijan Robinson. So let's just get this out of the way. Is Bijan Robinson your RB1? Yes. And how does he stack up against other elite prospects sort of like the last decade or so?
Yeah, I mean, he's my RB1, and I couldn't imagine ranking him otherwise. I don't think anybody is. And it's funny because when you threw this question at me in the show sheet, I was like, man, that's a really good question. Like, I need to go kind of deep dive and look at how he does stack up. And honestly, as much as I love Bijan going into this process, after I did that thought exercise, I love him even more, man.
Yeah.
I went back and compared him against 14 where we'll term like elite running back prospects. So Derrick Henry, CMC, Chubb, Zeke, Fournette, Saquon, Melvin Gordon, Dalvin Cook, JT, Kenneth Walker, I threw in there too. Brees, Ty Gurley, Joe Mixon, and Najee Harris. Just to name a few. And what I compared Bijan against was, one, his collegiate career yards after contact per attempt, breakaway percentage, his career PFF elusive rating, and his single season best PFF elusive rating, with meeting the threshold of 100 carries. And Bijan just popped like throughout the comparison.
Yeah.
He's first in yards after contact per attempt against this sample size. He's 9th in breakaway percentage, and he's also first and also PFF elusive rating and single season PFF elusive rating. So, I mean, like I said, he just pops in everything that you look at from a tackle breaking perspective. And even when you look at the pass game utility, he was 7th amongst these 14 running backs in yards per route run. So I think that he's got that ceiling as well. While he might not have the elite ceiling of CMC and such in the pass game, his utility in the pass game is still going to be extremely good.
Yeah. The way I've seen him, at least through my model and such, has been like, I mean, his top comp through the model and through the lens of that model was Breece Hall, but he's like a Breece Hall plus. Like, he's basically doing the things that Breece Hall can do, but he's been better at doing those things. And that's nothing against Breece Hall, because Breece Hall is also a monster, as we saw last year before that ACL. All right, so after Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs is sort of the consensus RB2 at the moment. A lot of people are even drafting him ahead of Jackson Smith and Jigba. But I've seen your rankings. I've seen your takes. You've got Zach Charbonnet ahead of him right now, especially if they do end up having the same draft capital or similar draft capital. So before we talk Zach Charbonnet, because that's going to be really interesting, I think, let's talk about Jahmyr Gibbs. What is it that sort of worries you about him, at least compared to how the consensus seems to view him? Because how the consensus seems to view him is very, very, very favorable.
The consensus is extremely bullish. And I'm not trying to toss shade at Jahmyr Gibbs and say that I hate the prospect. I mean, he's my RB3, but everybody talks about this as an arbitrary cutoff line, the 200-pound mark. It's arbitrary until you actually look at what NFL teams have done. And we always say that volume is king for running backs. Okay, well then it's harder to craft the volume narrative for a running back like Jahmyr Gibbs, who weighed at 199. If you look back to 2017, the list of sub 200 running backs that have had at least 200 touches in a season is Phillip Lindsay in 2018, 2019, Myles Gaskin in 2021, and Dion Lewis in 2017 and 2018. That's it. That's end of list. So unless we're talking about like going back to yesteryear, like Chris Johnson, and I've seen the comparisons to him and Jamal Charles and stuff like that, like those are legendary players, outlier players. Like, that's not the consensus, and especially in today's NFL. So his weight is a concern for me. And we're assuming rational coaching too, JJ, with like the pass game role. Like, that's still a projection. To say that he's really good in the pass game does not mean that he is going to end up with Alvin Kamara production. He could easily be DeAndre Swift. And that's not a knock on him, but that's not the same type of ceiling. And we're also projecting at that size that he's going to walk into an NFL offense and he's going to garner goal line carries, the red zone work. And if that doesn't happen, then what are we talking about here? Like, and just to give some context here, and I threw this out on a show earlier this week, it's like Jahmyr Gibbs is not that far and away a different from a size perspective. Yes, from an athleticism perspective, he's different, but how is he that much different from a size angle than James Cook? If he walks out of his rookie season with like a James Cook type of year, people are going to be extremely upset about that.
Yeah, I've even looked at the weight stuff, and it's part of the model too, is weight, just straight up weight. I mean, it's a very, very important factor. And I looked at the weight stuff a lot this offseason in particular, and even when you adjust for draft capital, because the argument against that is going to be, oh, well, we don't get a lot of sub 200 pound or even sub 205 pound first 2-round pick running backs. And that's not wrong. There's not a ton of them, but there have been a decent amount of them. There's been guys that just haven't really panned out that well. And when you adjust for that, when you adjust for draft capital, it still doesn't really paint the best picture for Jahmyr Gibbs. I don't mind Gibbs whatsoever. I think he's a good prospect, but I think the issue is that there's been sort of just this ignorance towards the weight stuff, as you noted, where I think at the very least, the way that I look at these prospects is like I go into it and they're perfect prospects when I start, and I just start trying to poke holes in them and find these red flags. That's a red flag for Gibbs. It's a straight up red flag. And I'm not even saying like, oh, he's there, he's under 200 pounds, therefore he's bad. It's just that even if you look at 205 pounds, 210 is really a clearer cutoff, honestly. And he's got 11 pounds to get there. And then, the Alvin Kamara comps that are out there, he's 15 pounds lighter than Alvin Kamara.
Yes, thank you. Like everybody throws the Alvin Kamara comp out, and I'm like, they're not even in the same ballpark stylistically and size-wise. Like, can we stop making this comp?
Yeah. And like I can understand, again, from like a production standpoint, really similar how they produced in college, but as players, Kamara can garner a lot larger workload just given that size. I think that's a big problem. So You have Charbonnet ahead of Gibbs. I mean, I know it was only like one spot. It's not like something super, super significant at this point, but I do think it's interesting. It's something that we should dig into. Some might say that Charbonnet is just sort of like a boring running back. Maybe he lacks some upside. Do you see that in him? And are there any strong comparables that you see watching him?
I mean, when I watch Charbonnet, I don't see the boring aspect of him. Like, and then he goes out and he tests well and he proves that part of his evaluation. Like, he had an 8.7 RAS score, which, I mean, it's not in the nines. It's not like something that's going to blow your socks off, but it's far from bad, especially when you marry that. Like, he hit both 70th percentile in speed and burst scores. Like, those things alone are going to, like, it feels the fact of he's got more juice than some people want to give him credit for. And if you also go back and look at what he did in his final season at UCLA, he was 14th in yards after contact per attempt and 22nd in PFF elusive rating. So I'll push back on that. He's boring and he's a grinder and stuff like that. The closest, he was a really, really hard player to comp.
Yeah,
because his style, like, he runs and plays like a back that has more weight to him and more power to him than you would necessarily think with his size. The closest I got, and it's not even a great one, was he's basically AJ Dillon on intermittent fasting. Like, he's just skinnier AJ Dillon. That's it.
I love it. Some of the analytical ones that came up for me, and again, this is purely based on what the numbers are saying. It's not even necessarily stylistic, but it was like a Sony Michel, Kareem Hunt sort of mold where guys who are able to carry that workload. I know Michel, hasn't really panned out to the point of what most thought, as he entered the league, but I do think that, again, Kareem Hunt isn't the most like electric, fun running back to watch per se, but he gets it done, like, especially in his heyday. So, I agree with you. I think Charbonnet and the gap between Gibbs and Charbonnet should at least be a lot closer than it currently is in the market. I'm not quite to the point of putting Charbonnet above Gibbs, but I've said on many shows this offseason, if that draft capital is close, I can see an argument / I could even put Charbonnet above Gibbs post-draft.
Well, and going back to the weight conversation just real fast, that's what pushes Charbonnet over Gibbs for me.
Exactly.
Because you're talking about, again, we go back to the tire narrative of volume is king, but if you're trying in your mind's eye to sit here and say, okay, which one of these guys can I envision getting 200 touches even in the rookie season, 250, 300 touches? That's not a hard case to make for Zach Charbonnet. That case gets pretty difficult, or you got to do some delicate squinting for Jahmyr Gibbs.
Yeah, I think the best pro Gibbs argument in terms of drafting him, maybe at the 103 or something like that. I like JSN more than him. I know you do too. But I think one of the best arguments for Gibbs is that if you're playing strictly the market, I don't think that his value necessarily is going to drop dramatically after year one, just given what we've seen historically from guys who were drafted early, et cetera, et cetera. So if you want to play that game, I totally get it. But I agree with you that there is a range of outcomes here with Gibbs that where he has more of that James Cook type first year, whereas with Charbonnet, if he gets the draft capital, of course, with Charbonnet, I think that the workload should be there for him in year one, assuming, he does get like round 2 draft capital. So after Robinson, Gibbs, and Charbonnet pre-draft, it seems like things are just totally up in the air right now. I mean, you could make an argument for so many different running backs in that RB4 spot. I think that you have one of the more bold picks at RB4 right now in your rankings. I love it. I think it's a lot of fun, but it's Evan Hall. Hall's someone that I've had my eye on too. I know we've talked about this on Twitter before, and my model definitely likes him more than the consensus does. But what do you love about Evan Hall?
I mean, ever since we went down to Senior Bowl and I saw him practice there, I mean, breaking down his film, everything, I love his game because he's one of the few running backs in this draft class where making the narrative, or at least trying to sit here and build the case of, okay, can he be a workhorse? Can he be a 3-down back? Is not difficult at all with Evan Hall. He fits the size thresholds. And for everybody listening out there were all these narratives coming into the process from Senior Bowl, what have you. I sat down and talked to Evan Hall at Senior Bowl, and I was like, what's your 40 going to look like? What's your testing going to look like? Because back then it was, oh, he's going to run a 4.6. Oh, he's not that athletically inclined. And then he goes out to the combine. He does every single test. He tests almost exactly like Bijan Robinson for everybody at home. Like if you're looking at the 40 time, his 10-yard split, his vertical, his broad jump, all the exact same. And he weighs in damn near close to Bijan Robinson as well. All these things just pop for me, JJ, as well as if you look at Evan Hull and we talk about, we want guys that have the receiving utility and the pass game upside. How is a guy that led all FBS running backs in receiving yards last year, was 7th in yards per route run and 16th in PFF receiving grade, getting capital of, projected in the 5th and 6th round? And he goes out and he proves that he is an above average athlete, a really good athlete. Yeah, I mean, people have talked about it, like, and I get tweets even now, like, you have Evan Hull at RB4. Okay, that's just for clicks. It's not. It's really not, with all the things that you look on Evan Hull.
So I'm going to give people a very easy cheat code for running back evaluation, and it's if you can find a bigger bodied back, which Evan Hull generally is, if you can find a bigger bodied back who has a good receiving profile, done. That's all. Really, like you want that combination. That's what Ramondre Stevenson had. Even like AJ Dillon had a decent receiving profile. It's just that everyone thought that it wasn't because that team didn't throw a lot in college, but his percentage of receiving work within his offense was not that bad. But you can go down the list. I mean, there's a lot of players like that where if you can make that combination, it's part of the reason why I was on Isaiah Pacheco last year. Same reason as AJ Dillon. The offense sucked. Wasn't great, wasn't throwing the ball a lot, but Isaiah Pacheco still had a decent reception share within that offense, and he was a bigger body back who had the athleticism. So I'm in on Evan Hull. Like I said, I love the boldness of him being your RB4 pre-draft. I think he's definitely someone that people should have an eye on. So, we talked about Jahmyr Gibbs and his size. There are two sort of smaller, productive running backs in this class that one of them's getting a lot of love and could go in the second round even in Devon Achane. And then the other one being Deuce Vaughn, who has a godly production profile. I mean, Deuce Vaughn's production profile is just otherworldly. But are these guys avoids for you in rookie drafts because of that size?
They are. They're both easy fades, and I've got both of them basically buried in my ranks right now. You won't see Devon Achane top 5. You won't see Deuce Vaughn top 15 in my ranks. And this comes down to, again, we're talking about the size. And it's really, I know we all kind of like to pick and choose our outliers, and some like to, go with guys and say, look, he's just that talented. That's just not how I approach it, JJ. Like, you're looking at both of these guys are under 190. Both of these guys are under 5'10". Going back all the way to 2000, there is no running back that has weighed less than 180 pounds that has gotten more than 150 touches outside of work done. Straight up. So unless you're saying that he's going to be work done over the last 23 years, I don't know how he's going to pan out. So that's really not an outlier that I'm going to sit here and toss my chips in on.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense to me, especially A-Chain, because the ADP and the cost in acquiring him is going to be a lot more significant than Deuce Vaughn. Deuce I can understand more just because he'll be like a dart throw 4th rounder, probably in like Superflex and stuff, so it's not as big of a deal, and at least he has that production profile. But I'm with you overall that we can't ignore the weight side of things. And I do think also, going back to Gibbs and talking about these guys, anytime you're digging so deep to find comps, good comps, that go back to like 2008 and 2009. Like at some point you can say it, CJ Spiller's a good comp or Chris Johnson's a good comp. But at some point you have to be realistic and say, maybe it's not a good thing that these comps are so old, that they're not in recent memory and they're not in today's NFL per se. I think that that's also somewhat of a problem with these guys.
No. And I absolutely agree. And that's why when I'm going back and I'm looking like, for statistical comparisons and stuff, like when I talked about it earlier with Gibbs, like I'm limiting that to the last 5, 6, 7 years because the NFL has changed. We see more committee backfields. NFL teams are not willing to, feed the type of volume they used to. Like, you're not going to see the type of volume to these smaller backs like a Ray Rice, Chris Johnson, like they used to do back then. That doesn't happen now.
Right, exactly. So one player who's just naturally difficult for numbers to fall in love with is Roschon Johnson, because he played a backup role to, again, one of the best prospects we've ever seen at the running back position in Bijan Robinson. So give me your take on Roschon. Do you think that he has a 3-down skill set?
I think he has a 3-down skill set in the sense that he's got the size to handle the workload. And if you look at where he's both the eye test when I was at Senior Bowl and his ability in pass protection drills before he broke his hand and had to leave, as well as just a numbers aspect. Like he was 20th in PFF pass blocking grade. So while I don't look at him as being an outstanding wide receiver, probably, or outstanding receiving threat out of the backfield, I think he can be serviceable. And with 0.91 yards per route run for his collegiate career, that puts him in a tier of guys that I'll look at. Okay, you're probably not going to like be a high value pass game asset, but if you combine the fact that he could pass block, the fact that he also pops on per carry metrics, like the guy had a 4.06 or higher yards after contact per attempt in each of his last 3 seasons. You marry all this together, and I think he could be a workhorse in that he's not going to come off the field because he can pass protect. That's going to give him enough routes to, if he falls into 50, 60 targets in a season, plus the early down work, yeah, I think that's absolutely in his range of outcomes.
I'm hoping that he's the Ezekiel Elliott replacement in Dallas, because they're gonna go that route. They need another running back on that roster, and so I think that we would all at least breathe a sigh of relief if you're a Tony Pollard backer, that it wouldn't be Bijan, but it could be Bijan's backup in college, and Roshan, who, again, someone who my model will just not like because it's production based and it's just the way that it is. But I think that you can subjectively look at this situation and say, okay, he backed up such a good prospect in Bijan Robinson. We can cut him a little slack for the lack of production there. Someone who you seem to be lower on is Kendre Miller. My model is just sort of whatever with him. I really haven't sort of gone the positive route or the negative route with him so far through my evaluation process. I'm just sort of, he's a guy who at least has decent enough size. Maybe he could become something, sort of in that, like, he was at least pro day for Izzy Abanikanda. He was sort of like in that tier for me. But what are you seeing with Kendre Miller? Because you seem to be a little bit lower on him.
I don't understand like the abject fascination with Kendre Miller. I've seen some ranking sets have him at like RB5 and that's this, again, we talked about it. Like after RB3, this is kind of a pick your own flavor type of running back class right now. So the thing that people are doing with me ranking Evan Hull high, I'm kind of like staring at Kendre Miller and wondering why, because when you turn on the film, I think he's a north-south grinder. I think he could be a volume back. But you look at the other parts of his profile, he had 0.76 yards per route run in college. He was 34th percentile in collegiate target share, never got a target share above 5.1%. So the pass game utility, you're really hoping this guy is a 1A early down complement in a committee to really kind of hit. And then we've got 1 year of not amazing, but not terrible tackle breaking metrics. Like he was top 30 in various categories over on PFF. I don't see a profile. Like, to me, Kendre Miller is not a guy that sits or stands at the top of the table for really a long tier of guys where you're saying, okay, he's good at this, or if he lands at this spot and they're a zone team, he's in that tier and he's not at the top of it. Like, yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Like, Izzy Abanikanda hopped up whenever we saw his testing, and you're looking at, okay, he's in that long tier. I think I've got more faith in Roshan. So if I'm looking at comparables in this class of guys that I'm hoping kind of fall into the same type of situations or roles in the NFL, I'm just not that enamored with everything I'm looking at for Kendre Miller.
So in that backfield at TCU in 2021, we saw Zach Evans with Kendre Miller, and then obviously he transferred. But some people absolutely love Zach Evans. He's probably like low-key the most polarizing running back in this draft class, like oddly. But some people love him. Some people just don't love him. My model certainly does not love him because the production was not consistently there in college. So where do you stand with Zach Evans? I'm really curious about this.
I have him in RB15. I have him buried. I'm not in on Zach Evans. And from even a film perspective to even looking at the numbers, I mean, the closest comp where size-wise and skill set-wise, I mean, I basically just said he's Ronald Jones 2.0. I mean, You look at his skill set, he's top 30, top 37 in multiple efficiency metrics, but he's a 0 in the pass game. Like the guy was 88th in PFF receiving grade. He never even garnered more than 19 targets in any season at Ole Miss. So looking at, again, the pass game utility, I'm like, you're not a good enough earlier down runner to where I think you're going to be able to cement yourself in that role to even get targets because you're on the field a ton. So looking at that, and you turn on the film, he's a linear runner. He's not extremely elusive. He's brought down by the first tackler a lot of times. His burst is okay, but I don't think he has a home run gear. So everything I'm looking at on Zach Evans, I'm like, okay, that's good, but not great.
Yeah, one of the things that I was really hoping for with him was that he would just have weighed in larger, because there were some, if depending on where you looked, he was like 215 in some spots, yeah. Whereas then, he weighed in at like 202. So like that to me was also a flag with him. But yeah, right now I'm more out than in. I do think that draft capital for him is probably going to go a long way, so we'll see where he ends up going. But he's a really, really interesting prospect just because he's so polarizing. Now, obviously, there's tons of running backs we haven't talked about today, so I'm just going to end with a very, very open-ended question. Of the backs that we didn't talk about, who are a couple that people should keep an eye on?
So the first guy I got to bring up here is Tajay Spears, and not staying with the Senior Bowl trend, but seeing Tajay Spears, again, we go back to the weight, him weighing in at Senior Bowl at 204, and he was listed. Like, how often do we see that happen, JJ? Like, where a guy's listed in the 190s, and then he comes out and he's actually heavier. And we talked to Tajay, and he's like, yeah, I bulked up to sit here and get up to this weight. I want to prove to NFL teams that I can handle the workload. And so him being 197, 196, 199 on various platforms where he was listed at, and coming in at 201, 204 puts him in a different tier, and looking at him from a little bit of a different light. Now, is that 210, 215? No, but that changes the flavor a little bit. And you marry that with his production metrics from Tulane, like this guy was top 15 in yards after contact, breakaway percentage, and PFF elusive rating. He had a 4.54 career yards after contact mark at Tulane. That's fantastic. And I know he didn't test extremely well, but he didn't bomb his testing either. Like, his RAS was not fantastic, but again, a guy that I think that could go on day 2. And if the draft capital follows suit, I think that there are a lot of things to like in his profile. The other guy, and I'm curious where you sit with him, JJ, that I want to bring up here, because I'm going to lead off with this. He has no pass game utility. Like, projecting him to have any type of pass game utility is wish casting at the highest level.
Let me guess the direction you're going here. Let me guess. Are you going Dwayne McBride here?
Yes. Ding, ding, ding. You got it.
Yes. Are you into him?
I'm into him, and I'm curious where he goes in the NFL draft. Like, I think his draft capital could surprise, and he goes like round 3 to an NFL team. That would not shock me at all, because the way that I break down these players, like, yes, his pass game utility is total wish casting. Like, the guy got 10 targets in college.
Yeah, five receptions. Yeah.
I mean, it's bad. But the other part of his prospect profile is, if you look at him on early downs, if his tackle breaking translates to the NFL, oof. Like, Dwayne McBride has been top 12 in every efficiency metric that I care about from tackle breaking, like yards after contact percent, breakaway percentage, PFF elusive rate. He's top 12 in all of these over the last 2 seasons. So from a production standpoint, he looks fantastic in that ilk. So I'm not forecasting an extremely high season, but I'll kind of lean into my best comp for him, which was Damian Harris. Could he go to an NFL team, get 200, 250 carries, double-digit touchdowns in 1 year? I think it's possible for Dwayne McBride, and I'm curious where he goes in the NFL draft and how the NFL kind of looks at him.
I was looking at him for my mailbag episode that is dropping on Friday. You guys will hear this episode after the fact, but I was looking at him for a question on that, and the one thing that sort of concerns me is that typically, and I think this is sort of like a Devin Singletary situation, or I guess there's some running backs historically that we've seen where they didn't have a huge receiving profile in terms of just raw receptions and reception share, etc. But a lot, maybe Kenneth Walker's a better example. Kenneth Walker didn't have the best receiving profile in terms of receptions, raw receptions, but he was getting just an obscene amount of work on the ground where you could at least tell yourself a story that the team didn't want to utilize him or overutilize him because he was getting so much work on the ground. Whereas with Dwayne McBride, his raw volume isn't that absurd. It's not as absurd as I thought it would be. And that's what scares me a little bit, aside from the fact that he has the 7th worst reception share that my models database has seen. So like, I get it. I think that McBride though is someone that, and I hate to use this as a cop-out, someone who's going to be probably more of a best ball asset moving forward, even in Dynasty, where he could just be a touchdown scorer, could be a good goal line guy, which is totally fine. And you can make the argument that Damian Harris has been that way, so far throughout his career too. So I can see that for sure. I just am such a sucker for the receiving numbers that McBride has been someone that I've just kind of pushed aside and said, I think someone else is probably going to like him a little bit more.
Yeah, and that's probably a similar bucket. Like, I'm not over the moon for him. I have him right now at RB10. But in a similar bucket, again, I'm not over the moon on him, but again, like you're talking about, could he end up, like if you take the late dart throw in rookie drafts, and he falls in that type of bucket where his value in Dynasty will not eclipse, like trade value and such, will not eclipse the production that he offers you. And so that married where you're probably not going to have to spend more than like a 3rd round rookie pick to get him, then it's probably the juice is worth the squeeze.
D-Bro, thanks for hopping on and talking running backs. It's greatly, greatly appreciated. For any of you not following Derek on Twitter, you should change that right now and look him up at Dbro_FFB and check out his work over on Fantasy Pros too. You can follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB, and remember to head to lateround.com for all the things I'm offering. And that includes my prospect guide. You can buy it now for $14.99, and with that purchase, you'll get an updated version the weekend that the NFL draft is over, so that you're all set and ready for your rookie drafts. Again, check that out, lateround.com. There won't be a mailbag episode this week because I'll be away, but I'll be back in your ears next week with an episode on this year's wide receiver draft class. You won't want to miss it. Until then, take care.